So I think if this war continues, and again hundreds and thousands of people are dying, and there's no end to it, and the United States is unwilling to talk to Putin, then we can see a huge rise of anti-American emotions in Europe.
This is Maike Hickson from LifeSiteNews. We are very pleased to meet today with Stefan Beig here in Vienna, Austria.
My pleasure.
We are meeting here with you because you are a veteran journalist. You've been a journalist for 20 years. In the recent time with the Express, a large news outlet. Recently you started working as a freelance journalist. And we would be very interested in learning from you as an Austrian. With someone you have interviewed, Cy Hirsch, and also LifeSite's collaborator Jack Maxey. So you are a journalist willing to present an alternative view on foreign policy matters. And so we would be very interested in learning your view on the current Ukraine conflict and how you, Austria, and your neighboring states in Europe are affected also by the US policy of furthering this conflict.
Well, yes, I had the pleasure of making twice an interview with the foreign minister of Hungary and also the personal advice of Viktor Orban, who is also Orban. And I think Hungary, as on a political level, is the most outspoken here. And what they say is actually pretty simple. They say we in Europe are suffering the most, probably because of this war we are suffering. It can only be ended through negotiations. So conclusion, let's negotiate. This is what they say. This is also what Slovakia actually is saying now. And Austrian politics is not as clear in this, but at least our chancellor also said that, from Washington to Brussels, it's like we are like trapped in always the same conversation. And we as a neutral country, which Austria doesn't belong to NATO, we should also talk to others who have another view. And so I think Central Europe, for example, where we are with Austria and Hungary and others, we actually prefer to have good relations with Russia in general. Austria, since the 60s actually, is having now pretty good relations, of course on an economic basis. And so I think the majority, this is also what the polls say, the majority wants negotiations. This is also the last poll from Austria, the official ones from February. It's already some month ago, but it's more than 50% who say we should negotiate. There's only about 30% who say let's continue to support Ukraine till they get the Russians out completely. And the rest is not as clear, but there's an interesting aspect in here. There's also about 30% who said a few months ago that they are very afraid that if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, we might be the next. So the emotions in Austria, for example, are a bit mixed. If you, on the one hand, on the long run, people prefer to have good relations with Russia. This is the mainstream. It's not always as clear in the media, but this is what many people want. On the other hand, of course, especially the older generations who might have experienced the Second World War, there are still some fears, that the Russians might come to us. It's not, it's by flight, it's more than 700 miles from Austria to Ukraine. It's not far away. It's just, in a day you can get there with your car. And so this fear is also there, and some might be a bit afraid that this could happen. And this is also what's officially said. But in general, in Austria and also in Germany, by the way, the majority wants negotiations. There was a poll done about what Pope Francis said. He said we should negotiate. Mm-hmm. And then there was huge criticism in basically all media, also in Germany. But the majority then said, in a poll in Germany, they agree with the Pope.
So you have a discrepancy between the published opinion and what the people in the country feel and think about the situation.
I think that the position that we should continue and support Ukraine till it defeats Russia completely in the Ukraine, I think that this position is in a publicized in the media much stronger than among the people. As I said, there are people who also think like this, but they're not as many.
Yes.
So it's like the other way around. Let's put it this way. Yeah.
And especially now that we have experienced this war for 2 years with huge human loss on both sides. And how is Austria itself also affected by this war now? Are there any consequences for Austria and in particular and in Europe?
Well, Austria is affected. I mean, of course, whole of Europe is affected economically, and also the majority of guys, the energy sector is highly depending on Russia, and we still get it from there. And this is actually quite important for us. And there are other countries, so almost all countries have relations actually to Russia. And in spite of the sanctions, they were searching for some ways to continue in a more hidden way. Let's put it this way, yeah. And the high energy costs, of course, are a really big issue now for us in Germany, and Austria is strongly affected by this. We have many refugees. Well, actually, the Ukrainian refugees are not considered such a big problem by the Austrians. They're Europeans. Their education level is not bad, and they're usually willing to integrate and go to school. You see, of course, many SUVs here in Vienna. If you walk through Vienna, or if you go to different parking places, you will see many cars. Nice cars, good cars from Ukraine, yeah. But also Ukrainians, what we see is we have young Ukrainians here, and they are not fighting. Yeah, there's an official, there's a demography of Ukraine, and the official one, you used to find it in the internet, and then they put it away. Find the one from 21, but the one from 23 is even showing that the 23-year-olds, there are hardly any left in Ukraine. Some might be dead, of course, and others are in Poland, in Germany, in Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Austria, and they prefer to study, go to universities, and not fight on the front. And this is what we also notice. And what is special for Austria, and it's pretty uncommon, and what is different to many other countries belonging to the European Union, we are not part of NATO. Austria is neutral since the 50s, and Austrians have zero interest in joining NATO. This is also very special. This is the thing the most clear. I mean, there are like between 5 to 10% who want to join NATO. It's like about 80% who think that neutrality is fine, and 85%, yeah. And I think it's absolutely not realistic that Austria will join NATO. A few people wish, but especially as long as this conflict continues, I cannot imagine this. Because what is also special in Austria is that the European Union has a very bad reputation. It's very unpopular in Austria, and the Austrians usually don't like when people whom they feel they have not actually elected talk on behalf of things that matters to them, and they have no possibility to have an influence. And the same is true, I think, to NATO. Mr. Stoltenberg is talking about highly sensitive issues now for more than 2 years. He's talking about things that matter and which might bring us closer to a war. He has done so in spite of the fact that actually NATO should be only defensive. And if he does so, and if Austria is part of NATO, and Austrians will listen more carefully to what he says, I cannot imagine them accepting this.
So there is this not congruent, there's not too much overlapping here of interests between Austria and the foreign policy of the United States. Would you agree on this with regard to Ukraine?
Austrians don't want an escalation of this war, definitely, and I think what's in the interest of most Austrians is that this war is finished now. And as Hungary says, and I don't agree with everything what Mr. Orban says, but what he says here is very simple. It can only be done through negotiations. It cannot be done on the battlefield. And also, well, there's also, I mean, the Austrian military is also making official, is talking about what is happening. There we have one officer, Markus Reisner, and he's often also interviewed in German television, and he's giving, from the beginning of the invasion, he's talking about the situation on the battlefield. And from the very beginning on, he was less optimistic than others. I would not say that he was pessimistic, but let's put it this way, he was realistic. And he said from the very beginning that certain hopes that just Ukrainians with their mental force will defeat the Russians, that this doesn't actually make any sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds just like Colonel Douglas McGregor, whom LifeSiteNews also has interviewed in the past, and he has predicted from the beginning that it is impossible for Ukraine to win a war against Russia. It's just a question of reality and not of propaganda or wishful thinking. So how would you describe what the relation of Europe toward the United States in this situation should be? If the United States are at this point not looking for a peaceful negotiations and end of this conflict, but instead seem to be furthering the conflict, escalating it, sending more weapons, what would you recommend to the Austrian government if you had a chance?
The Austrian government should invest much more strength than at the beginning, especially to negotiate, to better understand what the Russians also want, to at least talk with them. This is even what Henry Kissinger in one of his last interviews said. Actually, the problem is, he said, we don't really know what they want. Yeah? And I think that, of course, when there was a war in Yugoslavia, I think there were also, at this time it was different, there were European politicians who went to Slobodan Milosevic and talked to him, and okay, maybe they were not successful, but let's just give it a try. And if you try for 15 times and then the 15th time you're successful, it was worth it. Yeah. And the problem is, I think that Europe was relying in terms of its defense and security a lot on the United States. European politicians, European Union did so because, especially I think after the wars in Yugoslavia, from Yugoslavia, because this gave us the possibility to invest in our welfare state. But I think on the long run, this is very, very harmful also to the relations between United States and Europe, because it's just natural that United States also has they have their interests, and naturally, if they invest in our defense, they won't do this for altruistic reasons. I mean, they also want something in return, and this could cause, on the long run, very severe anti-American emotions in Europe. Mm-hmm. So I think if this war continues, and again, hundreds and thousands of people are dying, and there's no end to this, and the United States is unwilling to talk to Putin, then we can see a huge rise of anti-American emotions in Europe, because people will feel trapped in a situation which they don't want, and they feel they are not in a position to change it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Especially since the war conflict happens on European soil. As you mentioned, Yugoslavia, Colonel McGregor told us also at that conflict that the American neocons were pushing for this war and did not do their utmost to find places of negotiation and finding peaceful solutions, but they seem to just wish for war. And but the problem is that their war policies are taking place on European ground, and so the Europeans are paying the price.
Even Ukraine is paying the price. I mean, when I talk to Ukrainians, actually, there are some who coming from Eastern Ukraine, and now people who, from the very beginning of, even when the invasion started, they had a different perspective because they felt badly treated by Kiev. I won't say that they're representative or they're mainstream Ukraine, no, but they exist and they also live in Vienna. And actually what several Ukrainians, in those especially who are also usually good, well informed, or I know someone who have in relations to, who belong to families who might be working in one or other way to Kiev, and they say that actually Ukraine was how shall I say, was lost in a higher conflict. It was between NATO and Russia, and Ukraine too weak to speak for itself and to solve also its own problems, which at the beginning were not geopolitical problems. It was it was inner problems with the Russian minority, but that Ukraine got lost and is now the one who is actually suffering the most.
Yeah.
And this is also why it's very logical for many Ukrainians to not having any intention to fight any further without any realistic perspective of ending this war like this and pushing the Russians out completely.
Yeah. Well, we are really grateful that you have told us and given us this insight from a European perspective. We really hope that our American leaders listen to voices like this, so that it's, as you just say, it's not even in the interest of the Ukrainians that's happening, and negotiations should take place so that peace can be reestablished. And thank you so much, Mr. Beig, for this short interview.
My pleasure.
From Vienna, Austria, Maike Hickson, LifeSite News.